It puts power in the individual's hands, but it's broken and being used against you at a time when you need it most.
And we are live on Who Wrote That Up For You. Today is Wednesday, November 2nd, 2022. I'm Sonia Ebron, co-founder at Courtroom 5.
And I'm Deborah Sloan, the other co founder at Courtroom 5.
We've got a marvelous show lined up for you today. In a few moments, we will speak with Alison Peck. Alison is a lawyer, a law professor, and the author of The Accidental History of U.S. Immigration Courts. And so we're going to learn a good bit about the immigration crisis and the way the courts are handling that. Before we get there, though, Deborah, what is on your mind today? What's our issue of the day?
I wanted to talk in general about courts cutting corners. For example, and I'm going to give a specific example. The state of Tennessee rewrote its statute about tort settlements for involving minors, where the old version of the statute basically was there to protect minors, and they would take an affidavit and it would have court approval. Well, now they've taken that away. If the minor is if there's a settlement amount of $10,000 or less. And in my mind, it's cutting, and of course they said it's because it saves money because they don't have to, since those things don't have to have court approval, then it saves the court money. And in my mind, it's again another way the court has of minimizing the power or the rights of people who are basically at risk, or people who don't have power. And so I'm also thinking about the foreclosure cases where there are non-judicial states and judicial states where people aren't allowed to go, don't have basically the right to have their case heard by a real court in foreclosure, because it's a non-judicial state and they have to sue the mortgage company rather than the other way around. So it's like it's basically, my beef is that the courts are cutting corners for people who are at a disadvantage already.
It's interesting that you bring that up today. I'm thinking about sort of just previewing our discussion with Alison about the immigration courts. I think so often we see courts acting with this sort of expediency to what they consider crises of one kind or another. You mentioned the foreclosure thing, and I know the way some of them operate, even in judicial states. One might be tempted to call them not real courts.
Right.
The way we've seen so many. I remember in Florida just watching the changes in case law during that
Mm.
rocket docket, as they called it, where they were just processing the removal of people from their homes so rapidly. It was a mess, but people were bringing up all kinds of what used to be black letter law, and the appellate courts were saying, well, no, we're going to change that. We got a housing crisis in the state, so
Yeah.
you no longer have that right. It's just ridiculous. So at any rate, thank you for bringing that up. Who Wrote That Up For You is sponsored by Courtroom 5. At Courtroom 5, we believe the courts belong to the people, in particular to the people who use them. And we, the people, are coming to claim our courts. So if you are in court without a lawyer, or you need to sue someone and can't find a lawyer to represent you, get yourself over to courtroom5.com. Try a limited version of our services for free, and we hope to provide some relief for you there. At this time, I'd like to welcome to the show Alison Peck. Alison, again, is a lawyer, a law professor at West Virginia University, and the author of The Accidental History of Immigration Courts. Love to welcome to the show, Alison. Thank you so much for joining us on Who Wrote That Up For You.
Thanks for allowing me to be here.
I'm really excited for this conversation. We hear so much about the immigration crisis, particularly at the southern border. And there's lots of politics around. Ultimately, a human rights crisis that have fallen on our courts. And so I'd like to just dial it back for a minute and understand what are the rights at stake in immigration.
The rights are really momentous for a lot of people. People are in immigration court when they are within the country and the government of the United States is saying that they don't have a right to remain in the country. And that, so
Mm,
that's what they call removal proceedings. Because
mm,
if at the end, if the government is successful, then a final order of removal will be entered and the person can be physically removed from the country. And so for some people that can be, there can be a tremendous amount on the line, either because they have built a life here, with family and jobs and things that they've been really investing in, or that there's a lot of danger, extreme danger perhaps to them in their home country, or sometimes both. So that's really why there's a lot on the line. Now it's different than if somebody is filing an application, say for a visa or for permanent residency or something along those lines. That's a different agency that they file that with. That's not immigration court. So immigration court is where the United States government is saying that someone doesn't have a right to remain and they're trying to remove them.
mm.
It's interesting because when we think about whose rights are being enforced, and so are these the rights of the United States that are enforced in these courts, or
Yeah,
are they the rights
yeah.
of the immigrant or potential immigrant, or
That,
how do we balance that?
That's a really good question. Yeah, the fact that it's in an agency, at the Department of Justice, which I know we're kind of trying to talk more about that, but this isn't part of the federal judiciary in the sense of like the Article 3, branch of government. It's part of Article 1, the law enforcement branch, and DOJ is a law enforcement agency. So that shows you right there that this system is set up in such a way that it is geared toward law enforcement operations. It is a
Mhm.
law enforcement operation. And so even though the judge is, it looks like a courtroom and the judge, wears judicial robes and so forth. And so, in many ways it acts and appears like a court. In the structural sense of our government, it's really not an Article 3 court like we think about. So that I think goes to your question exactly, which is that this is something that was set up in order um, to effectuate legislation, the Immigration and Nationality Act, that said that people can only stay under certain conditions, and if they're not in those conditions, the government has a right to remove them. So yeah, in a way, I think you're right. That I'm not sure we talk about the government having rights exactly, but it kind of is the same thing, right? Is what you're saying. The Immigration and Nationality Act has become more sophisticated over the years. Well, I don't know, maybe that's the wrong word. It's become more complicated over the years. That much is for sure. Um, because originally there weren't a whole lot of specific rights for individuals built into it, and it was happening that a lot of times people were seeing really harsh effects of the way it was operating, and they said, well, but this person has family here, some of them are US citizens, and they need that person here, there ought to be an exception for that. And it used to be that people would have to get somebody to go to Congress for them and file what they called like a private bill to try to get special relief for that person. And over time, Congress said, okay, we shouldn't do it that way. We ought to recognize some rights or, defenses for people. So there are some things like asylum. If you claim that you would be have been or would be persecuted based on your race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, you can say, I request asylum and I shouldn't be sent back. And that's something you can raise in the immigration courts as a defense.
And so this is, I guess, the closest parallel in my mind would be sort of state administrative actions like workers' compensation, or maybe VA benefits, and in the VA. Is there a right to appeal those sorts of decisions when it comes to immigration courts?
There is, and yeah, I agree with you. It is exactly that agency adjudication, like what you've just identified. And so it's been over the years kind of made to look more like a court, but it's really effectively agency adjudication. And
Mm.
yeah, in the immigration system, there is a right to appeal. There's a couple of levels within the Department of Justice itself. So there's the trial court level. And then, if an individual or the government is unhappy with the result at the trial court level, they can appeal to the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is also within the Department of Justice. When that board issues a final order, it is then possible to take what they call a petition for review to the U.S. Court of Appeals that governs whatever judicial circuit that immigration court sits within. So at that point, you do kind of jump over from the law enforcement into the judiciary, the federal judiciary, in the Article 3 sense. And so you have a chance to get your case reviewed again there. Um, so yeah, there are a couple of potential levels of appeal.
I think typically with workers' comp and those sorts of state administrative actions, when you jump over to the judicial branch, it's oftentimes a de novo review, I believe. In other words, the real court, if you will, takes, takes the issue up anew. Is it the same in immigration then when you jump over to the judicial branch?
For law issues, yes. If it's purely a question of law, then yes, it is a de novo review by the court. But in immigration, they're pretty strict about fact issues. So even the Board of
Mm.
Immigration Appeals will just conduct like a clearly erroneous review of any
Mm.
factual decisions that the immigration judge made. And that
Wow.
includes things that can have a lot of impact, like do I think that this respondent is telling the truth? Um,
Mm.
like
Wow.
lots of times when people are testifying about what might happen to them in their home country, if they were to go back, you might not have documents to prove that. And so a lot of it goes on, the person's word. And so whether the judge believes them is something. Now they have to justify, if they say I don't find that believable, they have to point to a reason why. They can't just be like, well, I just don't feel like it. But if they've pointed to some reason, even if it doesn't go really to the heart of the claim, that is going to be only a clearly erroneous review. And even
Wow.
by the Board of Immigration Appeals, and when you get to the Court of Appeals, you're going to be kind of stuck with whatever
Yeah.
that immigration judge thought that day as far as the facts.
Wow.
That is extraordinary.
Mm.
It has a lot of impact. Yeah.
It has a huge impact. And I think the thing that is so striking to me is that when you're talking about the consequences of a decision on immigration,
Mhm.
you can be physically removed from the
Yeah.
country. That seems to be a almost a consequence of being convicted of a crime. You
I
know,
agree. I agree. And I think to me, that's why we shouldn't be treating it like a workers' comp, type of agency adjudication. Because, in all these other agency adjudications, which are common in our system, some people still don't agree we should have them, but we do have them. We have for almost 100 years now. But it's really different when you're talking about someone who can restrain someone's liberty.
Mhm.
I mean, people can be put in what they call detention, but it's basically jail for immigration violations while they're waiting for their hearings, and people can be physically removed, from their homes, from their
Mm.
families, from the borders of the United States. And to me, that's a really, really different situation, a really, really different power than somebody saying, okay, let's review whether the agency properly gave a citation, or something.
exactly. It's
Mm.
starkly different from the denial of benefits, for
Yeah,
instance, or that sort of thing.
yeah.
Right.
That's extraordinary. Allison, we will take a brief break here. Deborah has a quiz to handle. And then when we come back, I want to talk a bit more about your book explicitly and the need for lawyers get caught up in immigration courts. So we'll be right back.
All right.
Fantastic. Deborah, who won yesterday's quiz, if anyone? And what do you have lined up for us tomorrow?
We did have a winner today. Yesterday's quiz was in an appeal. Who writes the first brief? Is it A, plaintiff, B, defendant, C, appellant, and D, appellee? And the answer, of course, is C, the appellant. And the winner is Eric C.
Congratulations to Eric.
And today's quiz. In the lawsuit Kelsey filed against Dr. Fig Newton for medical malpractice, Kelsey applies the principle of res ipsa loquitur in his motion for summary judgment. What is res ipsa loquitur? If you want to participate in today's quiz, send your responses to quiz@courtroom5.com.
Looking forward to seeing the answers there. Let's bring back Alison Peck, professor of law at West Virginia University and author of The Accidental History of U.S. Immigration Courts. Thank you again for joining us, Alison.
Thanks.
Let me ask, where's the title of the book come from?
Well, the publisher I wanted to make that the subtitle, and the publisher wanted to make it the title because they thought that really summed it up. And I think they're right about that. The title really is showing that, when I started looking into why we had this system, why people were going to a law enforcement agency before a law enforcement agency to have their rights, such important rights determined. I found out that it was a situation that was set up by FDR just right before World War II. Well, it just started in Europe, and there were rumors going around that that the Axis powers, especially the Nazis, had spies within all these countries, and that the reason countries in Europe were falling so quickly to the Nazis was that the Nazis had spies that had kind of infiltrated their governments, and that they were like locals who people didn't realize were working for the Nazis, and then they would kind of, lower the drawbridge, so to speak, and the Nazis would roll right in. So that's what they thought, and that's what FDR's State Department thought was going on. And so after a guy named Sumner Welles went to Europe on behalf of FDR to kind of check things out, he came back and told FDR, we got to do this. It was something that people had been saying for a while. Let's put the immigration courts, let's put the immigration services into the Department of Justice so they can work with the FBI and catch spies. But there's obviously, some kind of, due process concerns around that. So FDR had held off on it for a while. And then he decided at that point, okay, I'm going to do it, because he didn't, there was no CIA at the time. There wasn't really a good way of catching spies. It wasn't something America was prepared for. And so FDR said, okay, I'm just going to do it. And his attorney general, Robert Jackson, later Justice Jackson, told him not to do it, but he said, I got to, and he did it anyway. And so it was one of those things where I don't think anybody thought it was a great idea, even at the time. They just were afraid of the wartime situation. And in the initial draft, there was something about let's revisit this after the war. But that got taken out before it got sent to Congress. And then, of course, FDR had died by the end of the war. Robert Jackson was now on the Supreme Court, not in a political position anymore. And so Sumner Welles himself had been driven out of the government. And so there was nobody really kind of minding the store anymore by the time the war ended. And the irony of it is that post-war research showed that this whole thing, what they call the fifth column, these people who are going to roll in and take over the government, it was a Nazi hoax. It wasn't even real. The Nazis actually didn't trust outsiders. And so they just were trying to spook the Allies by making them think they had all these spies. Wasn't even
worked.
True. It worked.
That's
and we're still paying for it.
That is fantastic. What an accident there. And so the executive branch, and it's essentially the national defense infrastructure is left with this burden now of deciding who can be in the country or not. And it's interesting because I would have thought, well, let me ask, before the Nazi hoax there, how was immigration handled? How were the rights of immigrants decided?
It was a pretty summary procedure. So that sort of a simpler version of what we have. It took a while before all the sort of rights and obligations developed. Originally, when we first started having immigration restrictions in the late 19th century, It was more about like, okay, we're going to inspect people when they come in on ships, and we're going to let some in, but some we're not going to let in. We might send back. And it was a little bit later, like early 20th century, when they said, okay, we ought to have a process for being able to remove people who are already have been here for a while, not just for a few weeks or months or something. And so then they needed a process for adjudicating that. When the laws got even more restrictive in the 20s and they really shut down immigration, then they really needed a process for it. And so at first it moved around from different departments. Like at first it was in the Department of Treasury because they were just collecting taxes from the ship owners. Then it moved to what was then called the Department of Commerce and Labor, later moved to the Department of Labor because they said, well, immigrants are workers, right? So the Department of Labor should do it. And so they really just had this system where they had what they called boards of special inquiry, where, if somebody was on the ship and they were being inspected and somebody thought, okay, we think you don't pass the criteria for being admitted. But if any, if the inspector wasn't sure or the person wanted to review, they could go to this board of special inquiry of 3 or later 4 people who would say, yeah, we think the inspector made the right decision, or no, we don't. And there was an appeal from that to a board that was sort of chaired by the Secretary of Labor, reviewed by the Secretary of Labor. So it was a kind of a bare bones version of what we now have, but it was in Department of Labor because it was seen as a workforce development kind of function. And it wasn't until World War II that it got associated with law enforcement like we have now.
Understood. That's fantastic. And so I would have thought that the immigration update, if you will, around 1965, would have changed the character of that as well. Was there a change in the character of the immigration courts as a result of that law? Or, because I know there were the immigration was now open to the whole world, right? As a result of the changes in the 65 Act. And so were there changes in the courts as a result of that?
Honestly, no. You would think there would be, but no, there really weren't. There have been some updates to what they do, trying to make it more fair and more transparent. So, like in the 70s, they stopped calling them boards of special inquiry, which always sounds really unfortunate to me, and started calling them immigration courts and immigration judges instead. And they started having them wear black robes. And then in the 80s, they said, okay, we ought to at least have a separation between the adjudicators and the investigators and prosecutors. They were all in the Immigration and Naturalization Service in DOJ at the time. So they said, okay, let's at least separate those out. So they took the immigration courts and put them in they put them in a sub-office called the Executive Office for Immigration Review. So they were in different sub-agencies. So now the immigration judges and the immigration prosecutors or investigators were within different sub-agencies in DOJ, but still within DOJ. So that happened in the 80s. There was some movement in the late 90s, early 2000s to maybe improve the immigration courts even more, but take them out into a completely separate agency, or maybe do what they call Article 1 immigration courts, kind of like the tax courts. But then September 11th happened. The focus was on national security again, and that kind of got shuttered.
Got it. Yeah, that is very difficult. Well, let's talk about the need and access to lawyers in those cases. Again, these are really difficult cases, and the consequences are huge. You can be arrested, you can be detained, imprisoned, essentially, and then removed from the country, dumped back into the circumstances that you left under often very desperate circumstances. Right, that sounds like a criminal charge to me. You would certainly want to have a lawyer. Do you have a right to a lawyer in those courts?
You have a right to a lawyer. You don't have a right to have the lawyer paid for by the government. So, kind of.
No, in other words.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't expect an immigrant, often seeking asylum, right, from some desperate circumstances back home, to have the resources to be able to hire a lawyer. So what are the rates of people in those courts without a lawyer?
That's a good question. I don't have data on that in front of me. I know a very high number do not have lawyers.
And what is their experience then generally in terms of outcome, in terms of getting, the facts on the record that a judge might consider? How do they fare?
It's going to be really, really tough if you don't have a lawyer. Now, one thing I'll say is that immigration judges are obligated to do justice, and they are obligated to look and see whether what they're hearing from a person suggests to them that they might have relief available. And some immigration judges are really great about that. Some immigration judges will see an issue and um, will sometimes even help the person get a lawyer, try to connect them with a nonprofit or something that might be able to provide a lawyer. If they say, this person's saying some things that makes me think they have relief available, I want to make sure they get represented. But there's not always an option to do that. And sometimes, the facts that would suggest that don't come out. And so, of course, the judges the system is so overburdened. Last I checked, and this was a few months ago, there were 1.7 million cases pending in the immigration courts. So the immigration judges they have their work cut out for them, and so there are better judges and worse judges, like in every walk of life. But even the best ones have their work cut out for them, and so it's just relying on the judge to be able to find the relief available and make sure that the facts get out is often not going to be enough. And so having a lawyer makes a dramatic difference. And the studies I've seen show that it is a radical difference in terms of your likelihood of getting a good judgment in your favor.
I can only imagine. What are the more common grounds for getting a favorable decision in immigration court?
Well, there's a lot of them actually over the years as the acts get more complex. There's a lot, but some of the really common ones are asylum, or sometimes there are other forms of protection that are related to asylum, like withholding of removal, or sometimes protection of the UN Convention Against Torture. And those are similar, humanitarian grounds that the person will be harmed if they went home. And it just depends on the person's particular facts and eligibility in terms of which they're eligible for. So those are possibilities. There are other possibilities that have to do with maybe you've got a different form of relief available. Like maybe you were placed in immigration proceedings, but since then you've married a U.S. citizen, and that citizen wants to make an application for you, and you might be eligible for a green card based on your marriage. And so sometimes you might be able to get the court to pause your case and send it over to the agency to decide whether you can have relief based on that application, and then your case goes away. There's also cases where you can have, relief based on the fact that maybe you have a U.S. citizen family member who will be extremely harmed if you are sent back. And so that can sometimes there's a couple of different ways that can also be a grounds for relief. So those are just there's more, but those are just some examples of some common defenses.
So are there rules of procedure? Are there statutes that apply? Are there, is there appellate case law that you could rely on to make your arguments for asylum or any of these other grounds?
Yeah, there definitely are. There's less of it than you would have if you were in federal or even a lot of state courts, but it does exist. So there are decisions. The decisions of immigration judges themselves are not public. They're often they're of a sensitive nature, and they're not published. The decisions of the Board of Immigration Appeals are sometimes published if they are of precedential value. And a lot of times they're published under a pseudonym or just initials or something like that to protect people's identities. And then, of course, some cases like we were talking about do go to the U.S. Court of Appeals, and so there's some case law there too. But another really good source of guidance is the agency guidance itself. If you go onto the immigration court's websites, the BIA, or the regulations that govern DOJ or sometimes DHS, if it's a kind of a related application. There's a lot of regulations and guidance there that tell you how it works. But the court system is it's less procedurally formal than state or federal court proceedings. Like they use the rule of evidence, but kind of generally, not real strict.
Mm.
Got it. Got it. You wouldn't want to hire a bankruptcy lawyer to handle this for you, right? Are there lawyers that specialize in these procedures in immigration?
Yeah,
Or
absolutely. And even within the immigration law bar, there are lawyers that do immigration proceedings, and then there are other lawyers that specialize more in like applications before the Department of Homeland Security. And it's really pretty different. The type of work is pretty different. So, and an immigration lawyer who's got some experience, even if they are not super experienced with immigration court proceedings, may still be able to do a decent job for you and know where to go to get the information they need. And there are even attorneys who might be a bankruptcy lawyer or something like that who say, I'm going to take on just asylum cases pro bono as my pro bono commitment, maybe for my law firm, and I'm going to work with trainers in my community who are immigration lawyers who help people get up to speed on this. And so I'm gonna do a few cases a year, or one case, whatever it is that I have time for, my pro bono commitment. And that kind of lawyer can also really be a lot of help. Because there are resources to help somebody who's just a little bit new at it.
absolutely.
Mm.
I could pepper you with
Yeah.
questions all day. It's such a fascinating topic. Just a couple more in the minute we've got left
Sure.
here. Oftentimes, lawyers have to be admitted to a specific practice or to practice in a particular court. Do immigration lawyers have to be admitted to practice in the Department of Justice court?
They do, yeah. You do have to be admitted to EOIR. You have to get a registration with them. One nice thing, though, about immigration practice is that because it's all federal law, you don't have to be a member of a particular state's bar.
Ah,
So, for example,
Mm.
here, at West Virginia University, our offices are in West Virginia, and many of our clients do live in West Virginia, but some live in Pennsylvania, some live in Maryland, some live in various other states. Usually they've had a connection here at some point. They may have moved, or maybe it was a family member or something like that, or they're nearby, and we can still represent them. So that makes it a lot nicer. In terms of for us as attorneys and for clients, if you happen to live in a tri-state area or something like that, a lawyer from anywhere in that region could help you.
Mm.
excellent, fantastic. Well, what advice do you have for those people who can't afford a lawyer admitted to practice in that area, and therefore
Mm.
have to represent themselves in an immigration court? What can they do to best protect their rights?
Well, the first thing I'd mention is that there are some in most communities there are some nonprofit attorneys who don't charge for their services. Now, as you can imagine, there's usually a long backlog. But the first thing, if you can't afford a lawyer, the first thing to do is to call a law school clinic like ours or a nonprofit and see if they or somebody else could represent you for low or no fee, because that does exist. So that can be a great solution. But if you have to represent yourself, then I think that the best thing you can do is to look. Online. There are some websites, if you have access to that explain some immigration law basics for people who are not lawyers, and so you can look on online and get a general idea of what your rights might be. But absolutely, if you get a notice, absolutely go make sure you get to court. And sometimes that can be a long way and it can be expensive to get there, but you absolutely want to get there, because that gives you an opportunity to stand before the judge. And even if you just say, I'm afraid to go back to my home country, I'm afraid that I'll be hurt there, that tells that
Mm.
judge that you might have an asylum or some related humanitarian defense. And then that judge has an obligation to explore that with you a little bit more, and to help you and to try to articulate if you've got a claim. So first things first is definitely, get to that hearing.
Fantastic, fantastic.
Awesome.
And so the book is History of U.S. Immigration Courts. Allison, I am listing your website, AlisonPeckBooks.com, on the screen for our viewers. Where else can people find you online if they'd like to learn more?
They can find our law clinic, West Virginia University Immigration Law Clinic, online, and I don't have the URL for that handy. But if you
Mhm.
look up WVU Immigration Clinic, you can read more about our clinical program.
Excellent. We'll share that
Awesome.
in the show notes as well. Professor Peck, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today on immigration courts and the history of them. We'd like to have you back again very soon, but thank you and continued success in your work.
Thanks for having
Awesome.
me, and thanks for what you're doing. I think by everybody pulling together, we can make a dent in this thing and make the justice system work better for us.
Mm.
That's the goal.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Awesome.
appreciate what you're doing.
Right.
All right.
Extraordinary.
Great. Wow.
Extraordinary.
Wow.
So grateful to have folks like that working to increase access to justice. It's so important. There's so many issues like that that we all need to take a stab at. So just very grateful to Professor Peck for that work. Well, that's all we have for you today. Thanks as always for tuning in, and we will see you tomorrow.
Are you feeling beleaguered, angry, or afraid, as if things are spinning out of control and you're powerless to stop them? It's easy to just let things slide and hope they don't get worse. But they often do get worse. The thing is, you're not powerless. Our courts belong to us, and their purpose is to give power to the powerless. Don't let your grievances pile up without redressing them. You can handle this in court. Or, if someone takes you to court, you can take them to school.